Hello and welcome back to Parley. These are my on-the-spot responses to the prompts you folks submit. Hope you'll enjoy listening. This one is from EyePatchNotes. This is a parlay about a ChatGPT thing you did, and basically we're going to do a sort of autopsy of what that process was like, or the effect that it had, what exactly the role that ChatGPT was playing. We're going to do a parlay, in other words, where we talk about somebody actually using ChatGPT to try to actually accomplish something actually valuable, which I think is something that very few people have actually done, and then what role that's playing there. This is a parlay that I'm very happy to see because my stake on the large language model, generative AI, whatever issue is that people are being pretty dismissive, and it would be much more okay if we actually engage with what the darn thing does. Currently, I feel like there's a pretty obvious, and I think it is a bubble in AI investment. And part of the reason the bubble is there is that people seem, I'm actually going to use the term afraid to engage with what this technology actually does, actually is. And so I'm very happy to see somebody kind of engaging with that. I don't really agree with your conclusions, but you have something really useful here that I think is valuable to discuss. I telegraphed the AI thing at the beginning because I know that some people just won't listen to anything that has anything to do with AI in it. This is probably a good time to briefly stop the bus, but I just wanted you to know that's there. I think this is cool. I think it's interesting to break down what the role of these technologies might be. And I want to leave you with something because I know some people are just going to stop listening to the parlay or literally anything if it ever says anything positive about AI. How about this perspective? If you want it to go away, you need to do something to replace what people think they want from it, which means you need to understand what that is and what it is accomplishing, if anything. But I think that in this example, you'll see that it arguably is accomplishing something, just that is a thing you certainly could accomplish another way. So I think that's interesting. I hope I've convinced you. That's all the concessions I'll make to people who don't want to hear about the subject. But I thought it was worth saying. I do think that is the sort of the thesis here. So that's what I mean by like an autopsy of someone using it. We're not going to get into that much detail about like actual prompts, like mechanically using it. This is more of a social autopsy. Anyway, EyePatchNotes begins. Going to try a more conversational style with this prompt. Cool. I previously mentioned that the magic of Dice of Fate, an AI-generated song we talked about in a previous parlay, link in the description if you're interested, to the parlay and the song, to you, EyePatchNotes, is that something shallow, upon scrutiny, can still be impactful. The lyrics and sentiment of the song are simple, bordering nonsensical, but it still gets played on the commute playlists. Honing in on the AI aspect, one creator dilemma is that penning a work of art aligns with their vision. There's no surprise at the final product. Splitting with AI 60-40 or even 80-20 still leaves room for the creator to enjoy the fruits of their labor without knowing the exact taste. I'm going to read that part again because it's going to be important later. Splitting with AI 60-40 or even 80-20 still leaves room for the creator to enjoy the fruits of their labor without knowing the exact taste. EyePatchNotes continues, I feel this passage was given short shrift in the original AI inspiration parlay. You feel I didn't talk about it as much as I could have. Unpacking it, I propose there are two distinct feelings when enjoying media. What we'll call pride as the creator, and what we'll call novelty as the consumer. The reason, for example, why EyePatchNotes, am not jaded by the isekai flood yet, is that elements I like can be recycled and remixed without my direct expertise. Surprise can still be had as its own vector of enjoyment. Now, if I was the writer of such isekai content, I could not experience novelty because the content is, well, mine. Having fans and audience engagement is a vector of enjoyment, but not the same kind as working through a murder mystery or a tournament arc or whatever. So, very zettai naively, to quote some Japanese, one of the perks of whole or partial AI-generated content is infinite novelty. Remember, using that idea of novelty that we discussed before. This can be likened to the collaborative fiction of a tabletop game. Good example. We'll get back to that. Even with the scenario and characters known, the dice of fate can lead to novelty via uncertainty. How poetic, the name of the song too, but you mean conceptually. Remove the human interaction, but keep this dynamic, and we've arrived at my current stance on generative AI. So it's a nice thesis. Basically, what you're saying is that there's this benefit you perceive with generative AI large language models, where if you're the artist, you collaborating, let's just leave it at that, collaborating in general, can lead to you participating in creating something that also gives you the enjoyment of being the audience of that work at the same time. This is desirable. Absolutely, as somebody who writes and makes other things you might call art themselves, and also makes some things that maybe you wouldn't call art, but which I still would like to be surprised by, I completely agree. And I think that this is probably a pretty common thing that many artists have settled on. This is going to be a big point for this parlay. I think that a lot of existing artists know what you mean, but disagree that generative AI or large language models like do anything productive for that. And I also think that a lot of people who make art don't know what you mean. I think I do, but I think for a lot of people, there's two primary responses I can think of, basically. So I think they're important. The first one is that some people don't know what you mean, and I think this one bears less explaining. For some people, there's this idea that, right, that is what you sacrifice when you make art. You don't get to enjoy it as an audience member. And from a rhetorical perspective, this is nonsense, of course. Why not? Like, what? But why is it like important that you not enjoy it as an audience member? Like, okay, you don't have to enjoy the art you make as an audience member, but like, if there isn't a reason you need to not do that, wouldn't it generally be more fun to be able to enjoy that? That makes sense to me. We could largely move on, right? But I don't want to be overly dismissive. I do think that there is an enjoyment of being in that mode and then seeing other people's work and having the like machinations in your head of, let's say you wrote a book and you enjoyed creating a fantasy world, etc., and then you read somebody else's. I do think there being some dichotomy between those two things has value. I'm not sure I can easily put to words what that value is, but I'm in agreement with you here, at least as far as I can tell. I don't think that there is a good reason why people are so dismissive of the idea that art ought to benefit the artist. I think that to a lot of people, literally any analysis is unartistic, and I think that itself is actually unartistic. There's a quote that I really like that basically is, people who create with their hands, their head, and their heart are artists, is more, I'm paraphrasing, but more or less how the quote goes. And I think this is a nice idea. Basically, if you're mentally engaged and emotionally engaged and physically engaged, like that is more or less what we call art. It's not really any strict specific form. It's not any idea of like 60-40 or 80-20. It's not anything about like the tools. It's an earnestness of human engagement that makes you feel like you made art. And it doesn't matter a damn what anybody else thinks, really. And I think that here, that's a pretty clear example. Like, there's really no reason that couldn't include you enjoying the surprise of your own creation. Now, I would like to add that you don't need to do any of what we're going to talk about in this parlay for that to be the case. For example, there are surprises that kind of happen or are kind of a treat for you, even more so the more you focus on the work yourself and kind of aren't the audience for the work when you release it. Many fantasy writers have been delighted to see what questions their audience thought of about their magic system that they just didn't completely think of or didn't focus on in that way. Even reading other people's fantasy series, I can think of a couple key examples just off the top of my head. I quite like this subject, if you can't tell, where basically like the fact that the rest of the audience, other than me and other than the person who wrote the book, is fixated on this one theory has meaningfully added to the work. Like that, it's just like, that's a cool idea. That's interesting. And obviously, in some cases, it's going to be that over a large series runtime or production time, if a lot of books are being written, within a certain world or maybe a series, like it's a 10-book series or whatever, or it's just a big, the same writer writing a lot of books, it's entirely possible that those suggestions or theories or ideas will become part of the story. And I think that's cool. The audience suggesting something that is a really elegant idea, I think it is nice of you as a writer to be willing to take that on board if it really fits that well. And I think on occasion, the audience will land on something even better than what you thought of. That's just kind of neat. So I don't necessarily think that it's the case that the people saying, oh, but like when you make art, the whole thing is it's not for you to enjoy your own art as its own audience. Like, no, that's not really an argument. Like, I would be open to an argument why that needs to be the case, but like, nah, there's no special reason why that needs to be true. That being said, I do think it's worth saying that there is some dimension where you do still get that appeal. As you said, having fans and audience engagement is a vector of enjoyment. Yeah, not the same kind as working through a murder mystery or tournament arc or whatever. Indeed, also. So again, not too much on this point, but I mean, I think this is what we're here to do. It's worth breaking down. To me, the much more relevant point, and what's going to be my thesis for this parlay, is that creating something, even with the idea that you're meant to benefit from it, I feel usually is still very surprising. In many ways, like how it would be if you were experiencing it as an artist. And so I guess to summarize, and I hope that 10 minutes into this parlay, you're clear that what I'm about to say is not coming from a place of dismissiveness. I'm absolutely not going to dismiss any of these ideas for the remaining runtime of this video. But to be honest, my thesis going into this parlay is there actually just isn't a problem here. Like, you already can do this without any assistance. And by that, I mean, I already do this without any assistance. Experience the surprise similar to as if I was an audience member while making a work entirely myself. And as we go on, it sounds like you did a process similar to what I mean. So I'll unpack that a little bit more as I go on. But basically, the way that I feel and I think a lot of other artists would agree they're experiencing this, is that you have a bunch of ideas, and then piecing them together, you organically go on the journey of what the like plot of the story will be, for example, as you make it. And that's sort of one of the fun things about making stories in a certain way. Sometimes it will be, depending on the format of story, it might be a bit spoiled, sure. But I mean, in my head right now, I have a bunch of drafts, and one of them is for this fantasy series. It's probably going to be about 10 books. I have this idea for this, I think it's more than a gimmick, but gimmick, where the first 3 books will introduce 3 principal characters, kind of solo, and these books can be read in any order. And then book 4, those characters will like meet up, or, you know, it will cross over more, and then you just linearly read books 4 through 10. So you can read books 1, 2, 3, 2, 3, 1, whatever you want. It introduces those characters. Maybe you read the one that's more like, that seems like it would be your thing. And then it's got a nice little intro thing for people to enjoy. Anyway, I have in my head a lot of events that would maybe happen in that world to those characters. Fight scenes and developments with the magic system and key moments in the magic system, societal developments that come as a result or an indirect result of the actions of those characters. But I don't in my head see how those events will fit together in a way that will be a story rather than just like a very cool wiki to read, if you like. But that's what I'm excited to write. I remain excited to actually write and create that story because I want to go on the adventure with the characters. And one of the reasons I have not written the story yet is that for me to have the most fun, I want to learn about styles that I feel comfortable writing in so that the process of going on that adventure is sufficiently relaxing and fun to me. I think that will make it a better thing for everybody else to read, and I think it will make me have the most fun with it. I think it's more required for me, but I do think it will improve the quality of the finished work for other people to enjoy as well. I think it's much more important that my writing style be comfortable in that narrative than like precise, exacting, or excellent. I just don't, as a writer, I just personally don't think that matters that much. You could disagree, people do disagree. However, I will just say that there are writers that have that philosophy and the opposite, that like the quality of your prose matters more than anything. Both types of writers are currently very successful. So neither of them is correct by any meaningful metric. Like lots of people who are very critical of books like books by both kinds of writers. They both make a lot of money if they succeed in the industry. Like there isn't one that is right or wrong. Like it is not objectively true that prettier prose means better book. There's just not a meaningful way to say that. So go figure, that's my philosophy. You disagree. I would like that. There's going to be one more book in the world that's written this way, write another book that's written that way. But that's how I feel. And as we read on in the parlay, I'm saying this for EyePatchNotes to structure the parlay in a coherent way, but I'm also saying it for you, the audience, as a way to see. I think EyePatchNotes is having a similar experience to this, but is simply using ChatGPT to have that experience. And that my argument, if you can call it that, boils down to that I don't really disagree, but I just don't think ChatGPT is that helpful when doing it. It just doesn't do much. It isn't a terrible tool for doing this. I think this is one of the few things that ChatGPT is actually any good at, is sort of the wrong way to say it, but anyway, you'll see. This is a sensible use of this technology, and there aren't very many sensible uses of this technology, in my opinion. But I also don't think it's particularly useful or necessary here. And so while I'm not arguing against it in this case, that's not my stake in this discussion. My stake in this discussion is to understand the situation, as I said at the beginning. I will say that while I enjoy the same benefit, I don't want people to come away thinking you like need to use ChatGPT to get that benefit. I don't think that EyePatchNotes thinks that either. But we'll get into it. So that's my thesis. Just to say that I do think there are a lot of common interpretations to this topic, and as I complained at the beginning of the parlay, the bugbear of discussing AI is that a lot of people are dismissive, but they really think it isn't dismissive. Like, to them, it's just art can only come from a human, and that's so deep that further discussion can be deleted without thought. And like, that's fine, but no, I don't know, like that. Why though? There isn't a real argument in there. You're just saying you really, really, really don't like the implications of ChatGPT being useful for art. I mean, I might not like the implications either, but that's irrelevant. Like, what's relevant is if it is useful for those things. And if it is, then if you want it to go away, you should want to understand those points so that you can replace them with something else. But I think, as you'll see, it would not be trivial to do that in this case. So anyway, and one other note before we continue on. I just don't think it's that interesting because the way EyePatchNotes is suggesting using ChatGPT doesn't really involve this as much. But something I wanted to point out that I think is a more thoughtful, but actually still not really a good argument for this topic, is that current large language models basically just average human text. So they're not very novel in the sense of creating content, let's say. If you ask ChatGPT to write a passage of a novel, which I absolutely did as an experiment. I don't know why other people who are so fussed about this have not done that. It's not going to be able to do it well without some complex application of that technology. And I know that because I tried and it went very badly. I think it went very badly. It wrote something that is shockingly generic. Like, it's actually kind of uncanny how much it is just common works that have already been written. In some cases, I feel like I know which works it was borrowing from it to an extent, or at least that is very common, at least partly probably because of the popularity of that one work. It was strange, and I encourage you to attempt this yourself. If you're worried because you feel like ultimately it being interacted with at all is going to make things worse, well, maybe if more people could call it an open shut case because they actually investigated it, we could all just move on from this stupid piece of technology sooner. But anyway, this is something that I poked around with and was shocked to find how derivative it was, basically. I think I've often talked in these ChatGPT conversations about my experience with digital humanities in college. I studied this basically analyzing a corpus of text using code and mostly statistics to make conclusions. So a very simple thing is to detect the type of writer. So Shakespeare's work, perhaps. You may know that Shakespeare's work is actually disputed. Like, the body of work all being written by Shakespeare is something that some scholars dispute. How disputed that is, I honestly don't know or care, but it is a thing that people dispute. And one of the many things that people have done over the years to try to argue that one way or another is using digital humanities to analyze the frequency of like particle use. Particles are like, this is a Japanese name for a part of speech, but they're like the, of, and, for, things like that. Particles. Articles. I think English, they're just called articles. But anyway, I think of them in Japanese always. They're called particles. Japanese is very regularly structured around word, particle, word, particle, word, particle for most sentence structure formats. And so it's very obvious in Japanese and probably wouldn't vary as much in Japanese, but in English, particle use actually varies considerably. That is, if you write 100,000 words, how often, percentage-wise, you use particles is surprisingly precise for most writers. And so if you have enough of their work and it's public domain, it turns out you can just kind of copy paste it all into a certain type of program and it will just tell you who wrote it with shocking accuracy. Not for all types of writer, not for all types of work, but it is surprisingly effective for some types of work. ChatGPT more or less does this in a sort of inverse. It looks through the corpus of human data that it has scanned or stolen in many cases. And let's not forget that's where a lot of this is coming from, but I'm sure people already know that. And then uses it to create patterns. And while ChatGPT is in some ways really simple, has been called spicy autocorrect, which I think is funny, but probably a little bit of an oversimplification, and then has been called ludicrously complex. I feel like that's a little wishy-washy as well, because in many cases we just kind of don't know exactly what's happening. I think it is fair to say that it is doing a simple thing in principle, which is just that if you average the corpus of humanity that it has scanned and try to use that to create naturalistic language, that works surprisingly straightforwardly to create natural sounding language. That's just it. Surprisingly, it's actually not quite as hard as you would think to do that. Not to say it's easy, of course. It's still a sophisticated piece of technology. The point is that if you were genuinely trying to get like novel, I guess, ideas, if you like, right? ChatGPT would probably be pretty bad at that, but that's not really what EyePatchNotes means here, at least I gather. So I want to not shut down that idea. I think that's a sensible response, but it feels a bit off topic here. It's pretty on topic, and that probably wouldn't work very well. But I'm half saying it actually just because EyePatchNotes, I don't want people to overinterpret what you're saying as meaning that, since we don't go into a lot of detail about exactly what you did. And let's go into the detail that's there now. But we will get back to this point about ChatGPT averaging language. And like it turns out, it's actually surprisingly easy to create natural sounding language like that. We'll come back to that point later for something else. Continuing with the thing, EyePatchNotes says, somewhat going back to stuffy mode, one realization I arrived at after the original AI inspiration Parley is that my interest in generative AI may not actually be about automation. I feel I might have oversold that. Rather, I think I miss being surprised by my own work, very in line with your thesis before. For a refresher, given the format of Parley, and it might have been some time since discussed, I feel there are two distinct forms of enjoyment. Pride, as before, comes from creating something that reflects your vision. We don't necessarily mean excessive pride here, just that feeling, which we're going to simplify and say pride for now. Cool. And then novelty, as we defined it before, simple novelty, just coming from not knowing exactly where something is going. Doesn't have to be completely novel, just a bit novel. Yeah. Creators gradually lose access to the latter, novelty, because by definition, we know the answers already. Once the mystery is solved, the final chorus written, or the emotional payoff decided, there is no way to experience it as an audience member would. And as I discussed earlier, this is the central point that my thesis is tackling, though I don't disagree on a basic level. Obviously, you're not going to get the same fulfillment as somebody else would. Again, as someone who's saying I don't really ultimately see a problem here, but it's just going to take us a while to show that I don't see a problem here. Part of the problem that I do not see in this case, even though your conclusion is obviously kind of just true on a basic level, is that I just feel like I have enough reading. Like I have enjoyed the the novelty payoff of reading a book like enough in many cases. Like I guess I would enjoy reading a bit more, but I feel like I largely read the amount I want to read. This is not necessarily that good of a point. If you don't have that much time and you'd like to read more, but you also want to write, having a way to combine both appeals would be very nice. Like it's relevant. Like I want the same thing, as I said at the beginning of the parlay. Just to say that, yeah, of course, on a basic level, it's kind of unreasonable to ask for the exact same appeal as reading a book would be. And you're saying, like, right, of course, you kind of can't do that, but you want to get back little bits of that where you can. Going back to the point at the beginning of the parlay, this whole splitting with AI 60-40 or 80-20, rather than it being that you're splitting the actual creative work, which it doesn't seem like EyePatchNotes is splitting at all, you pretty much came up with everything yourself. You're saying that you want to split the surprise or the direction of the piece, something like 60-40, 80-20, so that you get some percentage of the surprise you would otherwise have gotten. Again, perhaps 60% of the surprise you would have gotten of having read a story all the way through. That seems achievable and reasonable. Anyway, this thought that, there's really no way to experience this as an organic surprise became unexpectedly relevant to this fantasy setting you're working on, which we'll here call Gatekeepers. For years, the setting has existed in a state I would describe as landmarks without roads. So this is a story you're writing, and the materials are like that. The prospective character's introduction, explosive barriers, major turning points, and other scenes have lived in my head for years. What stagnated was everything between those moments, as progress usually happened only when I deliberately sat down to work on the project, and my attention was often elsewhere. Now, just note with my narrative before, forgive me for briefly interrupting EyePatchNotes here, I was saying that this is the place where, as you organically discover how to connect those moments in the story, for me, that is where I am going to get some of the audience fulfillment. EyePatchNotes says, at this point, though, enter ChatGPT. Rather than generating a story wholesale, it behaved more like a conversational partner, continually asking what followed from an established detail. A character named Eros became the clearest example. Rounding to about a year ago, when I first described Gatekeepers to me, Sandy, she either did not exist or existed only in the vaguest sense as Mantis, which is I think that's a cool character name, a character with some awkward body ownership baggage and little else. Oh, I vaguely remember this character. I didn't when I briefed this parlay, but I do now. Right, okay. Over roughly a week of discussion, however, she transformed into one of the most developed characters in the project. Not because ChatGPT invented her, but because every addition implied another addition. A power suggested a weakness suggested a behavior suggested a personality trait. Eventually, entire scenes emerged from connections I had never consciously explored, despite carrying the setting around for years. Here is where I think some people are overly fixated on fetishizing effort, and the only thing some people care about when they hear this is how much did it come up with on its own. But, I mean, to be blunt, I think we can safely say it just isn't creatively fulfilling if it comes up with the stuff, and it is if you do. So if it was just acting as an assistant that kind of guided you as you came up with ideas for the story, that is different than it just making up the things, and I would personally like to dispense with that line of reasoning for now. What's more interesting to me is to see, as I said at the beginning, so what is this equivalent to if you were to do it without ChatGPT? You definitely don't need to use ChatGPT to do this. So what is the vague equivalent? Well, it would basically be like a well-trusted companion, like you with another human, basically. If you collaborated with another person, they could prompt you to kind of dig forward with those topics. And this could cause you to have the same experience you're describing, but just not with ChatGPT. So what does ChatGPT achieve compared to the human doing it? Oh, I mean, well, you don't have to have a human. Well, there's another thing, which is that, the human brings with them their own attachments, might not have the time to just sit around and be fixated on what I hope we can agree would be a very self-centered conversation if you just said everything in the entire universe about your story world like, and then another human just sat there only responding purely without ego, only to serve your story, I think we can agree this isn't all that fair to your fellow human. This is a task, and really the only benefit of ChatGPT is that it's a task that humans could do, but I would argue we kind of don't want humans to do in many cases. It's sort of negative in a way for another human to need to do. Now, I say that with the counterpoint in hand, which is that I, as a person, being that I have been writing for some time and did this in college and edited literary magazines and etc. with other humans, I mean, I have had the experience of basically just letting it be about this one story or being the other person and it was all about their story, like for a long time. When I took it was called my capstone in college. Basically, we just had to write a short novel. Simple assignment. It's just kind of hard to do, but it's fine. Like, that's it. And in that class, we were assigned literally no work and were given no specific details other than you need to write a novel beyond like a guideline of word count. And even those things, it's actually only because one of the students asked. And she said, I mean, if you're going to be like that, I'm going to tell you guidelines. But like, I don't think you would need them if you just tried to write. You're here to write a story, right? So just write the story. And the class was largely, we brought in our draft and focused generally on one person for the entire, hour, 2 hours, and with a break in the middle sometimes, lecture time. So we spent a long time on my story, very focused on as if the 5 of us were the staff of my publishing house and it's all about my story. Same thing with the other students when it was their turn. And I would have had a lot of fun hearing more of my professor's writing as well. She was a very good, interesting professor. But she didn't take a turn, unfortunately. I have read some of her work and it was indeed cool. Sonia Chung, if you're interested, was the name of my teacher. She was a great teacher. I think she was a good teacher. And so I feel I am qualified somewhat to say the benefits and drawbacks of that. Some people just hate it when I say something like, well, you need a human to do it. It's like, well, we want to need a human to do it. But I'm asking you, I mean, like, do you turbo urgently want a human to need to do it? Or are you just worried that humans will be devalued if this is replacing them? Well, I really don't think it is, because the goal here is to use ChatGPT to be self-centered, basically. Not trying to be negative, by the way. You're not doing something wrong. That's sort of the whole point, without inconveniencing another person. And of course, many people who want to not do this in front of a human, well, it's because of shyness. It's not because they don't want to interact with another person, as much as they just feel anxious about if they were to do that with another person. Ideally, if somebody was over the moon to do it together, yeah, I would like to, but I can relate personally to this feeling like, well, I just don't, it seems very messy. Like, it would require a lot of vulnerability. Vulnerability I probably want to get to anyway as a writer, but vulnerability nonetheless to do this with another human being. And so ChatGPT is accomplishing removing all of that. You can do it at any time that's convenient for you. And it can, if you are firmly in the driver's seat, deeply skeptical of it, but still use it, potentially accomplish quite a lot in a pretty short time. This is really one of the only ways I've seen any use from people around me and myself with ChatGPT. And I would agree with you that it is, reasonably useful at that. What it's doing is pretty humble. It's just prompting like the next question or pushing the thinking forward. And it's here that my thesis at the beginning of the parlay might sound kind of persnickety. Like, basically, I am then saying, well, but you can just do it yourself. I mean, I see the fun, potentially, in some other outsider prompting that next part of the story. You could imagine, maybe it would help if there was a more ideal, I think it would be more ideal, way of thinking about this. Let's imagine that you had somehow an entire audience, and technology has become significantly more advanced. This is an audience that can change their speed of perception of time. They sit there with you with a very altered perception of time while you live perform composing the entire novel from start to finish over the course of, I can only presume an entire year, basically, which they experience by kind of like jumping around somehow, or it's recorded, but we have some complicated way that they're responding like kind of in real time. I don't know what this is, but you have something in between ChatGPT and a whole audience of people. And when you have a plot point or write a chapter, they prompt and respond, and you explore further, kind of together a little bit. And this is, I'm being a little bit coy, technologically, specifically for something like writing a novel, I have no idea how you would do this. But obviously on a more local level, I'm talking about playing D&D, more or less, right? There is something like that we have that lots of people do, that I know you and EyePatchNotes have, of course, also done. And so this is a way that you can do that, as you rightly pointed out earlier. Very good point, I think. And so you absolutely can do this other ways. In the case of using ChatGPT, then, fully as a kind of assistant, a sort of a weird form of a secretary, sort of, I personally feel like this is a good idea in some ways, but just achievable other ways. Like, I just don't see ChatGPT itself doing that as providing a lot after we get used to the process of doing it. I found it very valuable for other humans to do it with me, but don't find it as valuable now. Now that I'm used to doing it, I feel like, well, okay, but of course the process basically just is, if you want to write this way, asking, well, why would they do that? I'll just give you a simple example. In fact, I'll do you one better and do it candidly right now. That seems productive. I don't know. So, for example, in my story, I basically have these three principal characters, as I described. And the idea of them is sort of twofold. As I said, you can kind of pick where you start. And so if you imagine that one of the books is an adventure novel, one is kind of romance focused, and another one is maybe like political intrigue, courtly life, assassinations and machinations kind of thing. Those are the three pillars of the story I have planned. So introducing them on their own and with characters involved with them, or perhaps the character is going to be kind of sideways from that theme, but we show a bit of that in their life, is, I think, a fun idea, potentially. I think there's potential there. Okay, so I had a bit of an issue, though. Pretty early on, I had a very clear idea of what societal idea would be introduced by this one character and then this other character. There are, because my magic system, without getting into it too much, involves surprise, and there's this important concept of surprise decay. If you use a magic thing over and over again, it gets weaker in my system. It inherently loses power by being used when it isn't as magical anymore. That's not really the explanation. I'm kind of oversimplifying, but you get the idea. I think it's a fairly resonant idea, even though it's not all that common. I have seen a few other stories pick this up. A lot of the time, magic gets stronger when it's left alone, and mine is kind of the opposite. Like, I mean, I guess if you don't use it, that's fine, but older magic would be very weak in this world, unless it was like totally undocumented, I guess. But the fact that it's older, so we know about it, and it's been around for a long time, is inherently unpowerful in my system. Okay, so this means a few things. One of the first things is that if you use magic for like military purposes or to guard somebody or something, you want to intimidate a lot. It's kind of like nuclear warfare in that way. You don't want to actually use the thing essentially ever. It's just kind of there as a deterrent, but this is obviously scaled down a lot from nuclear warfare. And so it will get used, but people ideally don't really want to use it, right? And so I had this idea quickly. I'm not sure I'll keep this, so I guess a minor spoiler for something I hopefully will have as a cool story for you to read someday. There's going to be assassins, and they're going to want to be in the shadows, masked. It's going to be like ninjas. I don't know. That's not what appeals to me as an aesthetic. I have a very different idea of what aesthetic they would have, but it's basically ninjas. And it makes sense. This society would want the type of thing that an assassination would give you. From an optics perspective, this is really good for the magic system in this society. So that's something like that will be in there. Have one of the characters be that, and this person fits pretty well there. Another one, normal stage magic, like magic, magic tricks, are very valuable in this system because one, they can look like legitimate spellcraft, but not like break because you used it. And two, it's triggered by surprise. To use your magic, you have to already initiate a surprise, and you can use mundane magic to do this. If I, pull a rabbit out of my hat, I can use that as the catalyst event to trigger doing actual magic. And so stage magic magic tricks are actually very, very useful in this setting. So probably let's just go ahead and say one of the characters should be a magician by trade, like a stage magician. What should the third person be? What should their job be? What would they need to do to be narratively warranting so much real estate in the story? Not what do I imagine them doing? I imagine them being a pirate. This character is a little bit the main character in my mind, and they are a deckhand initially when we meet them in the story. They're kind of a mercenary, but they're a deckhand. They go on a voyage, they discover a certain type of treasure, and this is for them the inciting incident to their longer arc in the story. That's what they're doing in my head. But that's not really what I need. I mean, if they're going to take up a bunch of time in the story, what would it make sense for them to have been doing or know about or inform? And more to the point, why am I going to want to follow them after the events I already know about? And so they're kind of boring to me. Well, I have someone who talks about the triggering of the magic and the consequences of like security or enforcement with the magic system. Well, this is a system where you lose the efficacy of magic that you use. Wouldn't that mean that if you're like a, again, military, mercenary, a pirate, you would want a supply somehow of magic or magical abilities? You would, and I had already written as an idea for somewhere that there would need to be like magic merchants. And it's kind of hard to sell spell ideas in this world because they lose power if they're revealed. And so you kind of have to give people like a brief basically of what they will get if they pay you the full cost. You're probably going to want to charge a commission on that. So like me telling you I have a spell that is it's like fireball, you need to pay me something just to tell you that. Probably just seeing the inventory probably needs to cost money because I've inherently slightly weakened the thing that I might be selling you. But then also maybe you should get some of that back if you actually buy it. It's like a security deposit, if you will. There's this whole it would be interesting. You see what I mean? Like, and you can think of lots of ways, like where do the spells come from? At the moment people dream them, so you have to like go around as a traveling merchant, presumably trading normal goods as well, like listening for a kid who's telling a weird story about a nightmare they keep having, and then you like pay the family generously to write down the story and then tell nobody else until someone's ready to buy it. I don't know, like that. And you could also steal them that way. You could potentially also steal like the knowledge of without a physical paper, like as these merchants for magic, you probably shouldn't write it down, I guess, right? But there might be some other way to steal it. Magical piracy sounds kind of cool in this setting. What if she's a magic pirate somehow, or was like an magic merchant, or maybe it went really badly, and it just occurred to me just now that one of the outs, if you were a magic merchant, would be to kind of cash out and just switch careers to being, like a mercenary, using all of the spells that you'd collected to sell but just didn't or couldn't. You would then have a leg up. You kind of don't have to pay the upfront starting cost of being a mercenary or whatever, and then you can provide some magical services, or hopefully mostly physical services, some sword and board, some raw steel, but then, having the magic as a backup. Or something simple like using magic to propel a ship faster, but then like you're also a capable deckhand on the ship. I don't know. It seems to fit pretty well. And importantly, I also don't know how you would like steal the magic, but that's a very attractive idea. The idea that in this world you can kind of double surprise, Uno reverse surprise, and like take or acquire, or maybe even like synchronize with a magical effect. Like if you understand where it's from, but then somebody else does it, it might be that acting quickly, you can kind of get in on it a little bit. That's a cool idea. I just had that idea as well. That sounds like fun, and I don't really know how that would work out. So I think what I would need to do to figure that out would be write the rules of the system very clearly, like the physics, if you like rules, whatever of that there is, and there might not be very much. This is kind of a medium hard magic system. This is an experiment with combining hard and soft magic systems, of the many reasons I want to write this. And so I think I need to figure out whatever those rules are going to be, whatever is a requirement. I want to know that. And I think that me writing this story, I don't want there to be that many of those. So that's going to be pretty sparse. And then I think I'm just going to go on the journey, and perhaps will. An obvious way to do it, but I don't really like flashbacks, would be to do it as flashbacks. She's seemingly a normal dock worker, but gets involved in some piracy and is always very prepared as we get a flashback to where she stole that from, or like the family she didn't pay properly for that spell that is now saving their lives, but they are pirates. Something like that. I'm not a very big fan of constantly using flashbacks that way, but I'm just saying that is one way you could do it. I'm delighted by the idea that I will not be doing it that way. That doesn't sound fun or surprising. I really don't like flashbacks in general. I think they're usually kind of a writing mistake, in my opinion. And it's only when they're so long that it's basically just a direction the story is oriented in that they can be okay. But I feel like a flashback often needs to be a story in and of itself to be not just making the work worse. And a huge amount of the time, I feel we actually don't need to see the flashback. But in this case, it seems relevant to her conscience that we like know where it's from, or how much of a conscience does this character have. So we'll see. And would you look at that? I'd actually already written her in as having this romance subplot where she's involved with these other people that the rest of their society doesn't really like. And if it's perfect, like, that's fun. I don't know. Like, she's a subversive character, but maybe has some complicated feelings about that. You inherently kind of need to leave people in poverty to use magic that way. Seems problematic. Maybe she has some response to that. I don't know. So in fact, all these people are kind of sort of inherently need to exploit people for anyway. But so that creates this little narrative, and I'm excited to see what happens with developing that part of the story. I just don't see it as being helpful beyond practicing the format to then need somebody else like prompting those questions. To me, it's just like that process has been demonstrated, and now I guess I don't really see it as being all that bad, though ChatGPT does use a lot of like resources to be run. But besides that, I don't really see it as being all that bad to be using ChatGPT for this kind of thing, just not completely necessary either. Another way to look at it, if you want a more measured perspective, is if, probably when, this service becomes actually like paid, you have to pay to use these things, it would be nice to just not need to. And so I do think it's something that can be done without ChatGPT. I hope I'm not glossing over any detail where you feel like it does need to be done by ChatGPT. My understanding, I'm going to read the relevant passage again, is that you found it helpful not because ChatGPT invented that character, but because every addition implied another addition. A power then suggested a weakness. It was a conversational partner, continually asking what followed from an established detail, just prompting you to consider the next possibility. So if that's the correct understanding, I think that's a cool and good writing process. I guess I would just suggest that it's not really necessary that another figure does that. Now, having the questions be somewhat random is another thing, and you're going to get to that in a minute. Novelty, EyePatchNotes says, is the word I keep returning to because randomness is not quite right. Familiar pieces remained familiar, existing themes remained existing themes, yet combinations appeared that felt both unexpected and correct. A tabletop comparison might be more appropriate than a novel. Even when the world, characters, and goal are known, uncertainty can still produce discovery, for sure. Which brings me back to the original AI discussion. Much of the enjoyment came not from having something created for me, but from regaining access to the audience side of my own project. Gatekeepers probably made more progress during that week than it had in years. And there's a spoilered out bit, which I want to read afterward. I'll click and read after, but I'd left spoilered out. So sure. I mean, I do also think there's a big thing here where it's like, if it got you writing and it's your ideas, I find it frustrating that some people would be like annoyed with you for employing ChatGPT to do that, when it does seem to me that you're interested in engaging with making the art. And in another way, like, there's a debatable amount to which ChatGPT is making people who would have been interested in doing creative work, like, uninterested in doing it. I'm just skeptical that that's actually happening that much, I guess, is my point. And that the kind of people using it are almost always people who were not really, they were only distantly considering doing it themselves anyway. And so it's not really preventing people from making something. And to be fair, I haven't heard this be a singular sticking point for people that are really frustrated by things like ChatGPT. Right. I can totally see how this became a positive thing for you, and therefore it's frustrating to hear everybody being so negative and in a way that doesn't really have much to do with the thing you actually did with it about it. It therefore feels like this thing you're accomplishing is getting criticized by everybody for reasons that really don't have anything to do with what you actually did. And at least that's how it seems to me. And I've got a lot of sympathy for that. People have really bad systems for the way they're doing things. And when somebody has a bespoke new system, I'm speaking from experience when I say people usually just oversimplify it as being, oh, it must be that bad thing I already know about. And like, no, maybe I have a sophisticated version of that idea. Also, if it is that oversimplified thing, like, who cares? So why don't you just see what it is? And then if it is revealed to just be boring, then that's fine. But like, I don't know. It kind of seems to me like people want, again, and with ChatGPT they do, want there to be no good reason to use this thing. And you could argue that I'm arguing that there still isn't. It's just that it can serve as a proxy for something another person or you yourself could do yourself, one way or another. Some people might even say something like, why not just roll a physical die to see what's going on? But having the average of humanity sort of steer you in a direction is relevant. Which is where we get back to that point I placed out here before. Something I wanted to add here that is not super relevant to the parlay, but I just thought would be of interest. And so EyePatchNotes, forgive me, I'll make this a little longer than it would otherwise be, because I think this is significantly relevant. You remember I mentioned earlier in the parlay this thing about digital humanities, analyzing a corpus of text with code and kind of statistics. And one of the things I told you about it that I experienced when I studied this is that basically it appears that it's pretty easy to detect people's like provenance, the provenance of a work, using how often they use things like particles or articles in their speech. ChatGPT, for all of its sometimes very simplistic actual responses or ideas, does do some surprisingly sophisticated profiling, basically using reverse digital humanities when you put in a prompt. That is, if you haven't tried this, you go try it. It's an easy experiment. How you word the prompt that you send in makes a surprisingly significant difference, a surprisingly consistent difference, and a surprisingly effective or ineffective difference when you ask for a prompt. That is, more or less, if you ask a smart question, you get a much smarter answer and a much less oversimplified answer than if you ask a less smart question. This is a huge deal for the effect that ChatGPT has on this type of use case. For one thing, it's not entirely fair that this is true, but it is true in my experience. If you are innocently oversimplifying, you're rushed, you're busy at work, ChatGPT extremizes the stupidity of that being rushedness, of that oversimplification. It extremizes that relatively not foolish thing. You're just busy, right? You're not necessarily an idiot. But ChatGPT will take the bluntness of that question and will often stupefy it by interpreting it as you want an oversimplified explanation. You, not necessarily wanting but needing an oversimplified explanation, might then just take it, and you have now been made stupider than you started. It's not really your fault either. You would have to specifically know to word it in a way that would be profiled as not giving you the explanation. Sometimes you can do this by asking a short prompt and trying to add something like, I'm already a professional in this industry who's been working for many years, and I'm looking for insider tips, not like the most basic entry-level thing in the world. So I don't know. I haven't played with that much, but this is a problem I kind of suspected early on and then dug into a little more, probably because I had a background in digital humanities. On the other hand, if you speak in a nuanced way and very subtly, in a way many humans would miss, demonstrate a willingness to be refused or contradicted, ChatGPT will do those things. Where it will not do them if you do not seem open to that as often. It will be less flagrantly confident, less likely to just proclaim itself an authority in the way that all of the news coverage has proclaimed it to be an idiot for doing, if you don't seem like the kind of person who is looking for that. I know because I have seen this happen several times with myself and other people. ChatGPT changes a lot based on how you ask for the prompts. And I think one of the worst things about ChatGPT is that it's really just a rich get richer thing, even intellectually. Obviously, financially, it's just like terrible in a million, thousand, billion different ways. It's just bad financially. There's so many different ways in which it's a problem. Between data centers and heat pollution, surprisingly, is actually a pretty big deal. Like it changing the climate of the place that it's in because of the data center's output. We don't need to get into it here. Anyway, jobs is a complicated but kind of not that complicated issue. There's many problems, but a surprising one is that it actually really only benefits people who were already smart. If you already had a good idea and you were already going to do something good, this might make it easier to do that, but it inherently doesn't create well-being in that sense, which is a significant issue because what I would like ChatGPT to do is teleport people to the good advice of a subject. Unfortunately, it usually does the exact opposite of that unless you were already the kind of person who wouldn't have stopped anyway until they found that advice. And so I think you being the kind of person who's using this in a arguably productive way, almost inherently that is the problem with ChatGPT. It just might not be a problem for you, and honestly it's not been much of a problem for me. You can also do things like force it to cite sources or repeat yourself. Sometimes even if you ask, it won't give a source, but if you repeat yourself, it will show you the source. That's happened to me before. Keeping an eye out for hallucinations, which will happen either way. I was quickly looking for antivirus software and had done a general search, and this was on my phone because my computer was compromised. So, the search engine put up a little AI summary, and I noticed as I was scrolling down that it has suggested a piece of like a Russian company's computer security software, when, as far as we knew, the computer was compromised due to a vulnerability significantly evolved in Russian espionage with a lot of routers. And so it's a pretty huge fail / oversight for I got hacked maybe by something involving, the Russian espionage. Recommend me some antivirus software. I'm not saying that Russian company's software is bad necessarily. I don't know. It's probably unrelated, but it does seem a little silly to recommend that right after, But I'm the kind of person who I am crazy. I am paranoid and crazy. I'm not going to miss that and just end up throwing it in. But I absolutely think it's fair to say that 9 times out of 10 people will. It is pretty common that people being rushed get put into a corner where it's a bit too easy to just accept that. And so it is an issue. I'm just saying that I don't think it's fair to say that that means then it is useless. If you change the circumstances a lot, that changes quite a bit. The outlook for that will change quite a bit. That's just been my experience. So yeah, I don't think that the argument that it is therefore bad just because, it has this imperfection, it really applies to what you're using it for, because I hope it's not annoying of me to argue this way. You arguably aren't using it for any of the things that people talk about or criticize it for, or anything at all, really. You're just using it as a sort of I almost want to talk about it as like a philosophical tool or a rhetorical tool, a sounding board to bounce off of as you communicate ideas. And this is very different than the way most people envision this tool being used, and it doesn't overlap much with any of people's concerns or problems with it either. So I just think that's interesting. And I hope that this was an interesting way to break that down, and I hope you see why that would be relevant. It is heavily affected by the input that goes in, and also, of course, like how you are using it to write a story. Saying that you're using it to write a story is simply inadequate for explaining what's going on, which I'm glad you went into some more detail. But of course, almost everybody doesn't mean what you're talking about. The spoilered out part. Click. Okay, ironically, every sentence above went through ChatGPT. despite my making no direct attempt to rewrite its wording, leaving this summary itself as the first collaborative writing experiment I've conducted with it. I don't understand this on immediate first glance. Every sentence above, so the thing we just read with the more serious thing, went through ChatGPT. So do you mean it wrote it, or you prompted it or wrote this and then you asked it to rewrite it? Like, or in the style of how you would write it? I'm not sure how to interpret that. But I sense here perhaps that there might just be, I don't want to overthink it, there may just be a sort of gotcha where a lot of people will have seen your prompt presented as natural human language, and then you can go, oh, but actually that was ChatGPT, therefore proving that it can write well, which wasn't in question for me if what you mean by write well is write coherently, normally, systematically. Or if what you meant was write like X person. That's one of the only things it can do. I would hope many people who criticize ChatGPT are now nodding and going, oh yeah, no, like that's like the thing that it does. The part of the whole problem is that it's stealing other people's way of writing. So it definitely can do that to an extent. Like that, sure, I'm not at all surprised that would be within scope. Though it is interesting to see how it will interpret certain styles. Anyway, I'm not sure I totally understand this point, though, and I don't want to leave it neglected. I will just say it doesn't, surprise me as per se. We talked about this a little bit with your previous, I don't know if it was actually the previous, but a previous AI prompt about that song, where I said, it doesn't surprise me even a little that AI would currently be able to easily create every aspect of that piece of music, though it's not clear exactly how much of it was created by AI. You can almost easily create all that is absolutely within scope. Something like creating musical notation is outright easy for these programs. That was something we could do using a different approach, like more math, 10 years ago. And things like the vocals, again, comparatively easy with our current technology. So I easily believe that the whole song could have just been AI generated with nothing but a prompt. It's also entirely possible that the person running that channel, we talk about it in the other parlay, but basically they have a whole channel proudly proclaiming that it's AI created love songs, as if it's like so subversive because love, but then AI, and that it's not, and the lyrics aren't that deep. But that's not necessarily to say that bad. It's not clear how much like editing, I guess you will, if you will, is being done by the program. When I was in my digital humanities class, something I'll leave you with is that I had this idea for basically using AI to auto-generate text, but in a way that was very you driven, and it was like this. 15 years ago or so, when I was in college doing this, a sophomore or whatever it was in college, I don't really know how old I am at this point in my life, I'm in my 30s. I of course know that. I basically propose that you try to give it so you start by giving it statistics of how often you or your desired style will write certain words. You then have it generate a bunch of text. I didn't know this at the time, but this is a very oversimplified version of how a large language model works. And then the idea is that you would like mega aggressively edit down the text and begin to tag certain concepts or names as like the main character or a setting or whatever. And you could potentially write a piece of rather sophisticated code that would sort of auto guide rail a story to be generated while you hacked off pieces that were getting distracted as a sort of more aggressive, more fiat wielding editor, I guess. That's weird. I was just interested in that concept. I care neither here nor there about actually doing it. And at the moment, largely don't see the point. To me, a lot of the fun is that I want to construct the book myself. That's the fun part. Although being asked these questions to follow up on by another human or ChatGPT would not ruin the fun, in my opinion. The thing I conceived in college kind of would ruin the fun, in my opinion, though that would be interesting to do. It might be interesting editing practice. But anyway, it would be like, it could be intellectually stimulating for a time, but it wouldn't really be at all equivalent or interesting to me the way writing a book would be. I would rather just write the book. So anyway, That's interesting. It's definitely a thing you can do, and it would be interesting to see what that writing is like. I don't know. I worry that in many ways, this is also just the case of the kind of general societal objections to generative AI and large language models being so simple that this conversation blows so far past them as to make them irrelevant, and therefore I shouldn't bring that in more. But it kind of seems like what you're saying here is just a reveal. ChatGPT can write like this. And I mean, I know, like, you're preaching to the choir, sort of. I just don't see the point in doing that. I would like to add, though, that you're a person who has been willingly writing huge amounts of text for long parlay responses. So you are certainly a person who, somewhat unique in these discussions, has already demonstrated that you are willing to do that work yourself. You just did this for the sake of demonstration, I suppose. Again, I'm sorry, but I don't completely understand what you're actually saying. And politely, it kind of seems like you're intentionally somewhat obscuring what you're actually saying. So I will leave it at there and hope I responded with something relevant to that part. It's a really interesting parlay. I like that you gave this example of, like, specifically, here is an exact moment in the production of a story and exactly what this does that is kind of like productive to move you forward from that position. I thought that was cool. That's just neat. Having someone break that down a little bit. And I tried to sort of break it down a little bit myself. So I hope those were helpful examples, and that this was an interesting look at some perspectives on this subject and how maybe the reality differs significantly from the way that ChatGPT is often accused. It has many problems. I'm just not sure they're the same problems that everybody is so hung up on. I don't think it is those problems almost at all, and they're instead different and I think worse problems for general society anyway. But none of that is to say that it isn't something you can use for productivity instead. Just that I'm not sure I totally agree that it is that unique in its ability to do that. That's really my only counter argument, such as it is. I in many ways, just agree with you here. So I hope that was an interesting look at that. And I would love to talk about these more. I know there is a follow up from you that is in the pipe that is sort of vaguely related, if I remember correctly. Scrolling. It might have been this. I think it is this. Anyway, so I was excited to do this one for quite a while. It's fairly delayed. So I'm sorry for being so late doing this one. There's just a massive backlog of Parley right now, but it was a very cool prompt. Thank you for asking about it. And I'm glad that this can still be a space to discuss these things. One of the things I find sort of frustrating, if you couldn't tell at the beginning of the Parley, is that some people have a very thought crime oriented way of thinking about things like this, that you just can't discuss it because some evil is born at the moment that you entertain the possibility of this thing. I am very much a pragmatist in response. No, it's just being in denial to do anything other than deeply understanding this thing that you might have an issue with, and then just grappling with where it actually is in the world. It doesn't really do anything productive, therefore, in my opinion, to be concerned about it or excited about it without simply trying it and grappling with the pros and cons of the process. And I would be very interested. It's not the focus of the Parley. You don't have to do this, but just to say, I would be very interested, EyePatchNotes, what drawbacks you ran into as you went through. I'm sure you found some frustrations as well. It's just that you probably feel those have been covered halfway to death. I would just be interested to somewhat commiserate. There are many issues. I just don't think they're that similar to the ones most people are complaining about. I don't think those things are a real issue for people who are actually trying to get something done, but there are real issues for people who are actually trying to get something done, just not those. Anyway, and then obviously there's the financial, like, it's still a bad thing in the world, regardless of all of this. Like, that's just not good. As a resource expenditure, it's, some people have said not what humanity needs right now. I think that's a little bit more complicated, but mostly I think that's a good point. So anyway, I just personally am very in favor of these type of discussions being here. I think it's a good place for them. It's a place where we can consecrate and say, I am going to try to take this seriously. I hope I did a good job with that. I hope I presented some of various sides and provided that utility somehow. That's what you paid for. but also because I think it's nice to have it in a space where hopefully folks who watch Parley regularly, you're like a little bit used to this type of topic coming up. Yeah. We talked a Parley a couple times ago about like, what if you basically just deleted people from existence if they weren't productive? Like, we don't want to do that. It's not a good idea to do that in all likelihood. But it can still be beneficial to discuss that. Like, what are the problems with trying to do something about this issue that is in some places are overpopulated? This probably isn't a good idea. Let's see what's bad about it so that we can not do that and instead do something else. And here you could say, well, ChatGPT isn't an ideal solution, even if you unqualifiedly agreed it was good at this. It's still not as good as it could be at this by a long shot, and with many arguably unnecessarily large societal consequences. So if that's what we want, if that's a utility that is there, now that we know about it, we have a chance to remove it from its problematic context and get something useful without the consequences, to have our cake and eat it too, as it were. Anyway, looking forward to the next one. Feel free to ask things like this if you want, or follow up to this Parley, or not. It would also be perfectly fine to have a really critical about AI Parley if somebody wants that. That's totally fine. I might venture some guesses why there haven't been those yet, though. Anyway, it's not because there aren't complaints to be had. You can do that using a link in the chat description if you want. I would love to have you. I almost said chat, but of course that's because EyePatchNotes is a regular stream viewer as well. So let me thank you for your support. See you in the next one.